This is Chapter 10 of Bio 103, and today we're going to talk about environmental health. So we'll talk about toxic substances in the environment and other types of hazards in the environment, including many chemical hazards. We'll talk about some risk assessment and risk management practices as well. Our central case for Chapter 10 is a chemical known as bisphenol A, or BPA. Is a product that is used in hundreds of products, including cans and baby bottles, laptops, all kinds of toys. It has been linked to nerve damage, cancer, miscarriages, even in some low dosages. It's been known to leach into food and into the air and into our bodies. It's estimated that 90% of Americans have it in their bodies. BPA is what we refer to as a hormone mimic, in that it mimics the behavior of estrogen in the body, and therefore the body reacts to it as if it was given a shot of estrogen. So many researchers and advocates want some more government regulation on the use of this chemical. Some countries and some states within the United States have banned it, but it is still widely used in the United States. The topic for today is environmental health, and that is all about the factors in the environment that will affect our health and our quality of life. This may include many natural and human-caused factors. Practitioners try to prevent adverse effects on human health and ecological systems. There are four main types of hazards. The first hazard is known as physical hazards. These hazards are ones that occur naturally in our environment. They include things such as ultraviolet radiation, as represented by this woman getting a sunburn, as well as lots of natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, and so on. We can't always prevent physical hazards, but we can prepare for them through proper planning, monitoring, maybe try to avoid our exposure to something. So, for example, if you're concerned about ultraviolet radiation, what do? You put sunscreen on, or just spend less time out in the sun. There are some things we can do to increase our vulnerability to many of these hazards, such as deforesting sloped areas or channelizing rivers. The second category of hazards are the chemical hazards. These include synthetic chemicals such as pharmaceuticals, disinfectants, pesticides. They also include some natural chemicals, including heavy metals such as mercury or lead, that are harmful to our health. Next, we have biological hazards. These include all of the infectious diseases, whether they're caused by viruses or bacteria, other pathogens that parasitize our bodies. We can't always avoid the risk, but we can try to reduce the infection through monitoring, sanitation, and treatment. Often of concern with biological hazards are what are known as vectors. Vectors are any type of animal that transfers a disease from one host to another. So, for example, we see here a picture of a mosquito biting somebody. Mosquitoes are known to be vectors for malaria, West Nile encephalitis, and a number of other diseases. Ticks are another example of a vector. They carry diseases like Lyme disease. Rats and mice can help transmit diseases ranging from the hantavirus to the plague. And finally, we have cultural hazards. These are hazards that result from where we live, socioeconomic status, occupations, or behavioral choices. So sometimes they're also referred to as lifestyle hazards. Some of these we can minimize, others we have to figure out a way to manage them. Examples of cultural habits include smoking, drug use, diet and nutrition, crime, mode of transportation. The risks associated with many cultural hazards are often correlated with poverty or lack of political clout, because the poor people are less able to make the choice to move out of areas that, for example, may have high crime or have more pollution than others. Now, in addition to infectious diseases, there are also another category of disease known as non-infectious diseases. These don't spread from person to person. Instead, they may be caused by a variety of factors, some of which are environmental in basis. For example, it could be a result of chemicals or radiation in the environment, or they could be simply genetic. Some people have a genetic predisposition to gaining certain diseases like cardiovascular diseases or even certain kinds of cancers. Lifestyle choices such as diet, exercise, smoking also influences a lot of non-infectious diseases. So these include diseases like cancer, heart disease. In addition to poor hygiene, poverty can also foster some of these illnesses, as again, poor people are often less able to avoid many of the things in the environment that could increase the risk of these diseases. As you might guess, a disease is a major focus of environmental health. The leading cause of death worldwide is infectious disease, and in particular respiratory infections. And that may be surprising for many of us here in the United States, where we don't really think too much about infectious diseases as being a cause of death. There's just simply been less incidents of people dying of infectious diseases, particularly in many developed countries, thanks to improved nutrition, sanitation, hygiene, medicine. Having access to these things can greatly reduce the incidence of many of these diseases. But in poorer countries, infectious diseases can account for 50% or even more of all deaths. So you can see from this graph, there are a number of infectious diseases that are known to cause death throughout the world. While AIDS is a well-known infectious disease, respiratory and diarrheal diseases, including tuberculosis, claim more lives every year than AIDS. So you can see from this bar graph, the first one here, we have respiratory infections, which includes influenza, pneumonia. Here we have diarrheal diseases. Both of those contribute to more deaths than AIDS individually. And here's TB, tuberculosis. It has its own bar graph all to itself, and it combined with the respiratory illnesses and the diarrheal diseases here, you can see that they all do claim more lives than AIDS, HIV, than many of these other diseases. And we have some things like malaria as well. And then childhood diseases, which includes measles, pertussis, tetanus, mumps. It's nothing that might be surprising to many people in the West, especially those who decide to forego vaccinating their children. But yes, you can die of diseases like the measles. Public health has decreased the prevalence of many infectious diseases. Many, though, but including AIDS, are still spreading, particularly in some of the poorest countries of the world. Some, like malaria and tuberculosis, are even developing resistance to antibiotics. Some diseases can spread rapidly, like flu viruses, avian flu, swine flu. These are different strains of the flu. One of the things about the flu is that it mutates very quickly. So every year it's a new strain of the flu, and this is why it's recommended that people get a flu shot every year. Unlike many other viral diseases, where one inoculation can give you a long-lasting resistance to the disease, flu shots, because of the rapid mutations of the flu, aren't always effective from one year to another. Last year's flu shot may not protect you from this year's flu strain. Toxicology is the study of poisonous substances in the environment. Toxicity is the degree of harm a chemical can inflict. So anything material that is a poison or a toxicant is something we can be concerned about. The cliche is the dose makes the poison. That says that toxicity depends on both the nature of the chemical and the amount you're exposed to. Some chemicals, like for example mercury, is very toxic in extremely small dosages, so just a little bit of mercury can harm you. Other things might not be harmful until you get into much larger doses. A great example is vitamin A. You take a little bit of vitamin A, it actually is beneficial for your health. You take too much vitamin A, however, and it could possibly kill you. It can be lethal. Environmental toxicology is studying toxic substances in the environment, whether they come from human-related activities or not. Often study the impact of animals and plants to see if they're going to have an impact on human health. Indoor environmental hazards are something many people don't think about, but we spend 90% of our time indoors. So some of the hazards that can kill you in the environment include cigarette smoke and radon, which are the two leading causes of lung cancer. mold in homes and offices that can sometimes release toxic compounds, and often it's people with pre-existing respiratory illnesses like asthma or allergies that are most vulnerable to the effects of mold. Asbestos was once widely used in insulation until the early 70s when they stopped using it, but asbestos is kind of a friable, fibrous material that when little tiny bits of the fibers get suspended in the air, they're floating around. When you inhale them, those little tiny fibers then are scratching the interior of your lungs, and they can cause all kinds of lung problems, including a disease called asbestosis. Lead was widely used in pipes and soldering. It was added to gasoline to quiet the engine and make it run more smoothly. And it's also widely used in paints up until the early 1980s when it was taken out. Lead has been linked to learning disabilities, hearing loss, and even death. And this has led to the phase out of using lead in many of these things. It's no longer found in gasoline or paints or in new plumbing, although many old buildings could contain lead in their plumbing or in their paints still today. Polybrominated diphenyl ethers, or PBDEs, are chemicals that are used as a flame retardant. They're often applied to computers, furniture, carpets, things like that. If you bought a carpet or a couch or a bed in the United States, well, it's probably been treated with those materials. These chemicals act as hormone disruptors. They've been banned in Europe, but not in the United States. With chemicals, the old saying used to be a better living through chemistry. And there have been lots of benefits that many of these chemicals have brought to our lives. They've increased our food production. They've brought us all kinds of medical advances that have helped improve our health and prolong our lives. They brought us many modern conveniences. So there are lots of benefits, but we also have to take into account that many of them have some negative effects that we have to be concerned about. So we have to think in terms of if this chemical is too harmful, that the risks associated with them outweigh the benefits of using those chemicals. We should probably consider searching for some better alternatives and maybe changing some of our manufacturing plans to eliminate the use or the generation of these chemicals. Toxins are natural chemicals that are found in the environment. There's a fallacy, it's called the natural fallacy, which assumes that if it's natural, it's healthy. But there's lots of things that are in nature that are not exactly good for you. Poison ivy is a perfectly natural thing. Like many plants, it produces, however, a chemical that can be dangerous. So poison ivy, perfectly natural thing, but I wouldn't go jump in a big patch of it and roll around. Not all toxic substances are synthetic. Some of them exist naturally in our food. Some of them are produced by plants. Others may be picked up from the soil, or maybe animals eat the grass that might have picked up toxic chemicals, and then the toxic chemicals end up in the tissues of the meat. So there's lots of debate about what traces of these natural toxic chemicals could pose to us. Synthetic chemicals are also in our environment. We all carry traces of hundreds of these chemicals in our bodies. Some babies are born with chemicals already in their bodies that they absorb from their mothers. Not all of these chemicals pose health risks, but of the over 100,000 chemicals on the market, very few of them have been tested. They travel through the environment. We can be exposed to them in our homes, our workplaces, through our food, drinking water, air. They can even be transmitted from mother to child in the womb or through breast milk, and damage to our chromosomes, particularly if it's damage to sperm or egg chromosomes, can be passed on to children as well. Up until the 1960s, many untested pesticides were sprayed with the assumption that they were harmless to people, which is kind of ironic considering that these chemicals were manufactured for the purpose of killing things. So maybe it was a little naive for people to assume that just because a little bit kills bugs, that doesn't mean a lot might make people sick or something like that. So over time, though, research started to come in, and it was showing that many of these chemicals, due to prolonged exposure, could cause health effects in people as well as other wildlife. Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, published in 1962, distilled and summarized much of the research of the day on the risk DDT exposed to both people and wildlife and to whole ecosystems. Eventually this led to DDT being banned in the United States in 1973. Although many developing countries, such as India, still use DDT to control mosquitoes that spread malaria. There are different categories of toxicants based on what type of damage they can do. Many toxicants can be 1, 2, 3, 4, or more of these categories at once. But carcinogens, for example, these are chemicals that cause cancer. And oftentimes it's really hard to identify the link between a chemical and the onset of cancer, because it can take several years or even decades for cancer to show up in the body and be detectable. So it might be hard to trace back and say, oh, yeah, I got sprayed with pesticides 15 years ago, and that's why I got cancer today. Establishing that link with any certainty can be very, very difficult. Mutagens are chemicals that cause DNA mutations, and despite what you may have seen in popular movies, they don't give you the ability to shoot laser beams out of your eyes or have claws sticking out of your arms. Mostly they cause damage that can lead to certain types of cancer, as well as damaging sperm or egg cells, which can lead to birth defects as well. Teratogens cause birth defects by damaging the embryo in the womb. Neurotoxins affect the nervous system. These include many heavy metals like lead and mercury. Allergens work by overactivating the immune system. They trigger some type of immune response where your body just wants to get rid of this material. And it seems like in recent years there's been a serious uptick of certain types of allergies in children, such as peanut and other nut allergies. Not really sure why, but some people are so sensitive to these things that even inhaling little dust particles of peanuts can cause them to go into anaphylactic shock, which is why more and more products are carrying warning labels warning that they may contain traces of peanuts or were processed in a facility where peanuts are also processed, to give people a warning that they could be causing some type of reaction to them. Pathway inhibitors interrupt some type of biochemical process. So, for example, rat poison stops blood clotting. So what it basically does is it causes rats to die of internal bleeding. Endocrine disruptors are a whole category of materials that affect the endocrine or the hormone system. Hormones are chemical messengers. They're sent out into the body to tell your cells to do certain things. They stimulate growth, development, sexual maturity. They regulate some brain functions, appetite, sex drive. As your body produces various of these hormones, your cells respond to them. When the hormones reach the cell, they look for these little molecules on the membrane of the cell called receptors. So the hormone's floating around here, and then it finds a receptor and bonds with the receptor, and this sets a little signal into the cell telling it to do something. Whatever that signal is supposed to tell the cell to do, now the cell knows to do it. What hormone mimics do is they also bond with the receptor, just the way the hormone does. And when that happens, they tell the cell, just like as if the hormone had bonded with the receptor, to do something. And it may not be an appropriate thing. Other synthetic chemicals can block hormones and prevent them from telling cells to do certain things. So organisms have a number of defenses to many natural toxicants, things that found in the environment. Since we've evolved among these things for millions of years, we have things like skin and hair that are barriers to protect them. Other organisms have scales or feathers. But even so, many toxic materials can enter through food, water, air, etc. We have developed biochemical pathways in our cells that will metabolize these toxins, break them down into something less harmful, or make them more water soluble so that we can quickly excrete them from our bodies. Some toxic chemicals, such as heavy metals, can be stored in the body, and this can over time overwhelm our defenses. If the levels get too high, they can cause all kinds of damage to our cells and to our organs. And of course, synthetic chemicals, because many of them are new, our bodies often have no natural defense against them. Now, when dealing with a lot of hazards, we have to keep in mind that individual responses can vary greatly. Things like genetics can affect people's responses. Some people just get lucky and have a higher resistance to hazards in the environment. I'm sure everybody has heard stories of some uncle or somebody who smoked cigars until he was 80 and then got hit by a bus. And he was lucky. For some reason, whatever, he was able to avoid getting lung cancer despite smoking for a long time. But he was the outlier. He was one of the exceptions to the rule. For every person who smoked for 60 or so years without getting cancer, there's somebody else who got cancer in their 20s. Somebody on the opposite end of the extreme of the spectrum there. People who have poor health problems already, people have pre-existing problems, they're already more sensitive and can be more vulnerable to many of these hazards. There's also variation with sex and age and weight with various chemicals. The very young, including fetuses, infants, and young children, are almost always more sensitive to chemicals in the environment than adults. The EPA, however, sets standards based on adult responses, so there's lots of concern that many of the standards may not be low enough to protect the young. Now, in dealing with many hazards, there are two types of exposures. The first is an acute exposure. This is where you get a lot of a hazard in a very short period of time. These are easy to recognize. They stem from many discrete, easily identifiable events. So, for example, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill gave lots of pelicans and dolphins and other aquatic animals an acute exposure to petroleum. These are easy then to identify and link to health effects because you know there was a big exposure, and usually the health impact onsets very quickly after the exposure. The other category of exposure is a chronic exposure. This is where you get small amounts over a very long period of time. A great example of a chronic exposure is smoking. You inhale a little bit of smoke every day if you're a regular smoker. And over time, that can cause damage in your body that will accumulate and develop into significant health problems. Chronic exposures are actually more common in life, but they're harder to detect and diagnose because the damage they do occurs gradually and can take several years or longer to be detectable. Once again, it's sometimes hard just to point in one thing and say, aha, this is what caused your cancer. So the cause and effect is often really hard to prove. You have to do lots of research, often do studies with huge numbers of people and try to eliminate everything else they could have been exposed to before you can point to that one thing and say, aha, this is what made you sick. Toxic substances have effect on wild species and ecosystems. They can cause many species to decline through damage to their reproductive systems or outright killing them. And the effect it might have on the ecosystem as a whole could depend on things like, for example, if it's a predator species that was affected, then the prey will experience an increase because fewer things are eating them. So the prey species will actually increase in their numbers. However, if prey species are affected by a toxic chemical, predator species will then decline in their numbers as well because their food sources decline and more of them will be starving. This can lead to cascading impacts where the effect on one species can affect numerous other species that interact with it, and overall can affect the ecosystem's ability to function. Pesticides are also able to travel many distances. For example, a process known as pesticide drift, which is the airborne transport of pesticides, has been documented. We found traces of pesticides in the tissues of polar bears in the Arctic Circle, penguins in the Antarctic, and people living in Greenland, thousands and thousands of miles away from where these chemicals were applied. Toxic substances can also travel by water. Runoff will pick up pesticides and fertilizers, oils and greases from the land and carry them into rivers. Wastewater treatment plants could release tiny amounts of pharmaceuticals, disinfection products, and other things. These all can enter the drinking water and cause health effects downstream. Water-soluble chemicals can be picked up through drinking or absorption. Oftentimes, fish, frogs, and stream invertebrates are the first ones affected by these pollutants, so there are often good warning signs that there could be a problem in that body of water. Contaminants in rivers and streams can then enter drinking water, even migrate into the air, traveling hundreds and thousands of miles away from where they were released. Now, some toxic chemicals can degrade and become harmless. Others remain unaltered and are very persistent and can stay around for decades. Some, like, for example, heavy metals, they're elements. There's nothing for them to break down into, so they will never detoxify and degrade into something else. But many synthetic organic chemicals do degrade over time, and the rates will depend on the nature of the substance, temperature, moisture, and sun exposure. Some of these chemicals can break down into simpler products that may be less harmful. Others may be more harmful, though. For example, DDT degrades into another chemical known as DDE, which is also very highly persistent and toxic in the environment. Because many of these pesticides and other chemicals can accumulate in the tissues of organisms, they're fat soluble, so they can build up over time. This process is called bioaccumulation. And over time, as organisms absorb more and more of these chemicals and more of them get deposited in their tissues, they can then be moved up the food chain as something eats them. So, for example, plankton in this example here is absorbing DDT from the water. The plankton then get eaten by little fish, who then pick up the DDT from the plankton. The little fish get eaten by the big fish, who in turn get eaten by the osprey. So even if the osprey was never near where the pesticide was applied, it ends up getting some of this pesticide in its body, which can lead to problems. Another thing that happens is a process known as biomagnification, where the concentration of the toxic chemical can move up into higher and higher dosages. This is often the result of that rule of 10% that we talked about in earlier chapters. If you remember from previous chapters, only 10% of the biomass moves up each feeding level. So from the producers to the primary consumers, you only have about 10% as much primary consumer mass as you do producer mass. But oftentimes, because these chemicals can deposit themselves in the most edible parts of these organisms, they can migrate into higher and higher concentrations and get magnified as they move up the food chain. So what starts as a very low, insignificant concentration here among the water solution here, where it's 0.0000003 parts per million, it gets absorbed by the zooplankton, who then have a concentration in their bodies of 0.04 parts per million. That can lead to them getting eaten by the small fish, who now have a concentration of 0.5 parts per million in their bodies. The larger fish who eat the small fish now have 2 parts per million, and the osprey can have as much as 25 parts per million in its tissues as a result of this. So what seems like a very insignificant amount in the water supply can end up causing health problems higher up in the food chain as it gets magnified in concentration. And this has been documented in a number of cases. One of the most famous happened in Minamata Bay, Japan, where there was a battery factory, and mercury is often used to make a lot of batteries. So there were concerns that was the battery plant discharging too much mercury into the bay. So they did some testings of the water, found a very insignificant concentration of mercury, and thought, oh, okay, this is well below what's considered a safe amount in the waterway. It's no problem. But then they started noticing some strange things. The first thing they noticed was cats near the bay were having these fits and seizures, and they started calling it dancing cat syndrome because of these type of seizures the cats were having. And then people were starting to develop all kinds of neurological problems as well, and many people died as a result of this. And they traced this back to this biomagnification. The mercury was being absorbed by the plankton, then get eaten by the small fish, then the large fish, and then the large fish were getting eaten by people and cats. And then they were accumulating harmful levels of mercury in their body to the point where it was causing all kinds of problems with their neurological systems. So toxicants can change the composition of ecosystems, changing how organisms interact with one another by lowering the populations of many important species within the ecosystem, which can threaten many of the ecosystem services that we talked about in previous chapters. Another problem we have with many chemicals, including pesticides, is they can damage non-target species. Many pesticides that were used to kill insects that attack crops have also harmed bee populations, which can inhibit the crop's ability to reproduce because we want to keep the bees around to help pollinate our crops. Pesticides and antifungals that were used on many crops have been known to kill decomposers in the soil, which can inhibit the plant's ability to absorb nutrients and slow down the plant's growth. Studies on the impact of hazards on animals have involved many field work and lab experiments. Some of the things they've noticed were reproductive abnormalities in species like alligators and frogs, including drops in sperm count, as well as a phenomenon known as feminization, where male members of the species start taking on female characteristics. In human studies, however, it's hard to do studies in which you go around and just spray people with chemicals, right? You can't do that, really. It's unethical and illegal. You shouldn't do that. There have been cases where researchers in the past have done things like that, but it really is, like I said, illegal and unethical to do it that way. So they have to look at some other ways to try to find out what ways in which these chemicals can have an impact on our health. And one way is a case history approach, where you look for people who have certain health ailments and then look at their lives, look at the things they could possibly be exposed to, and if you can do enough case histories, maybe you can find some common factors in their lives. Maybe they're exposed to a certain pesticide or some other chemical in the environment that you can then trace back and link to these health ailments. Epidemiological studies occur when you look at people who are already being exposed to the chemical. So you might, for example, if you're concerned about the health effect of pesticides, you go to where people are using the pesticides. So you might go to farm workers or maybe workers at the factories where the pesticides are being manufactured and try to do studies, estimate how much they're being exposed to, and then follow them over time to see if they develop different health ailments. As you can see, these studies can last several years because, especially if you're looking for something like cancer, which can take a long time to onset. So, but if it's higher in the exposed group than it is in the general public, the hazard may be responsible. But once again, cause and effect is very difficult to establish. You have to get huge amounts of data on these things and be able to eliminate almost every other possible thing that they were exposed to. And boy, would it be easy if people were just exposed to one chemical, because then we could just say, okay, that chemical is what's making people sick. Unfortunately, you think about we're all exposed to pesticides and pharmaceuticals and fertilizers and cleansers and solvents and a whole bunch of other chemicals throughout our lives. So to narrow down one thing that could cause a certain cancer can be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do. The best way to show cause and effect is through manipulative experiments, where you actually expose a population to the chemical. But once again, you can't do that with people. You just can't do it. It's illegal and unethical. So instead, they'll do animal studies, often with rats and mice who are small, easy to take care of. They have rapid metabolism, so you can cycle through lots of chemicals in a short period of time and see what their effects are. Often when you do these studies, you'll expose different groups of your test animals with different dosages of the chemical to see what the effects are at different dosages. And then you'll plot the results on what's known as a dose-response curve, where response is what you're trying to study, whether it's seeing if it kills individual members of the species or causes them to grow tumors or some other negative effect. And then you will plot it on what's known as a dose-response curve. And here we have an example of a linear dose-response curve where there is a direct proportional relationship between the dose and the percentage of our test population that are affected. So the higher the dose you give to a particular population, the higher the percentage of individuals that will get this type of response. So once again, when you're dealing with things like that, individual responses can vary. So not everyone will develop tumors at a specific dose. So you will see what percentage of your population will have this effect. One of the things they look at is what's known as the LD50 or ED50. LD50 stands for lethal dose of 50%. This is the amount of the toxicant required to kill half your test subject. ED stands for effective dose, so ED50 means it will cause some type of effect on the subjects. So that's when you're looking for something other than just simply death as your outcome. The higher the number, the lower the toxicity. That means that you need to give a lot to a population before you see a significant number of them dying or having some other type of response. Now, you can look at this curve. What we're noticing here is what happens in many chemicals is at extremely low dosages, you will see virtually no effect. None of the members of your population will be affected. And this is because often these low dosages are quickly excreted or broken down, metabolized, and they're able to handle any problems caused by these tiny dosages, so you really don't see any effect until you reach what's known as the threshold. Once you cross the threshold dose, then you start seeing an effect in your population. So your curve in this case will look like 0, no effect at these really low dosages, and then we get to the threshold, and suddenly a certain percentage of them start getting affected. And of course, there's our LD50 there. This is where half of our population died at this particular dose. And of course, when you extrapolate to look at human effects, you have to take an advantage, if you're doing rat studies, how much more does the average human weigh than a rat, and use that to try to multiply up the dosages to see what an equivalent dose you could expect to have a similar response in a human population. Now, of course, it'd be really easy and really great if all of our curves were linear, but in many cases, they're not. Some of them have weird shaped curves. Some of them we actually might reach a point where the response may decrease with higher dosages. So they call these U-shaped or J-shaped curves or inverted U curves. In this case, the dose does not make the poison. We'll often see these types of things in endocrine disruptors, hormone disruptors, where you see some response at extremely low dosages, but then for some reason there's this crowding out effect where you suddenly see just a less of a response at very high dosages. And of course, as I said before, it'd be really great if everybody was just exposed to one chemical. That would really make this type of research very easy. Unfortunately, we're all exposed to lots of different chemicals, and we don't even always know what the effect of different combinations of chemicals can have. Some of them may cancel out or even multiply each other's effect. This is called a synergistic effect, where the impacts are greater than the sum of their constituent effects. DDE, the breakdown product of DDT, may actually cause or inhibit sex reversal depending on the presence of other chemicals. And because there are thousands of chemicals on the market, we can't always test for every combination. It's just impossible. It would take millions of years to do those studies. Endocrine disruption is a particularly big challenge for toxicology. Like I said, they often have these unconventional dose-response curves. One of the researchers who pioneered a lot of the impact of endocrine disruptors was Theo Colburn. Unfortunately, she passed away just a couple of years ago. But in 1996, she published a book called Our Stolen Future. Described how many synthetic chemicals may be affecting animals' hormones. And one of the things often discussed in many of these is bisphenol A, which we talked about at the beginning, which is suspected of causing certain types of reproductive harm, including reduced sperm counts. Some other research of the safety and impact of bisphenol A came about almost accidentally, where Dr. Hunt at Case Western Reserve University noticed that about 40% of developing mice eggs in her study group had some chromosomal problems. She looked into it and found that a lab assistant had washed the plastic cages and water bottles with a harsh soap, and the cages were then contaminated with traces of BPA. So she tried to then recreate this accidental cage exposure, and they found that developing eggs exposed to BPA had similar damage as what she noticed in her earlier test subjects. Additional testing where they gave female mice oral doses of BPA over 3, 5, and 7 days showed the same abnormalities at lower levels. Mice given BPA for 7 days were the most severely affected. Hundreds of other studies of low dosages of BPA have documented harmful effects in other lab animals. So more and more scientists are urging that regulators adopt the precautionary principle to restrict bisphenol A. Risk is something we have to take a lot into account. Just being exposed to a hazard or a threat doesn't automatically produce an effect. As I said, a lot of individual variation comes into play. So a substance threat depends on its identity and strength, but also how often, what are the odds of somebody actually encountering it, how frequent they might encounter it. So there's lots of other factors, including individual and sensitivity, that can affect whether or not you're actually going to have an effect. So a lot of hazard analysis and risk assessment is about probability. Probability is the likelihood of a certain outcome, and risk is the probability of something harmful will occur. So if you were to take a vial that had an LD50 of a certain chemical and you just took a big swig of it, your risk of dying right there is about 50%, because you have about a 50-50 chance of dying from that dose. So good luck with that. With risk, oftentimes our perception doesn't quite match up with reality. Every day there's some risk just getting up and getting out of bed. But our perception doesn't always match reality. For example, the old cliche, people say, you're safer in an airplane than you are driving on the highway. But more people are afraid of flying than driving. And you have to wonder why that is, if you're more likely to be killed in a car wreck than an airplane crash. Of course, there's a number of reasons of that. One is simply control. When you're behind the wheel of your car, you're in control, right? You know what you're doing. You're confident with your driving ability. Everyone else on the highway is an idiot, of course, because you don't control them. But the same thing with flying. You don't know anything about that. When you get on that plane, you're trusting your life in the hands of someone you don't know, some stranger. You don't know what his behaviors are. He might have just pounded down 3 martinis at the airline bar before getting on the plane. So you don't know. And of course, we had recently a very serious tragedy in which a European airliner went down because apparently the co-pilot had some psychological problems and just decided to deliberately crash the plane. So again, when you're in an airplane, you're not in control. You don't know what's going on. So the natural thing is to be more afraid of this, being more apprehensive about this. Sometimes it's what we don't understand or we don't have familiarity with them. People are more comfortable with driving because they do it every day. Flying is a less frequent activity. Other things, we don't control, nuclear power, toxic waste. You think about what's going on at 3 Mile Island. You don't know what's going on in there from day to day, whether there's problems going on, whether there could be another accident occurring there. But when you put stuff in your body, that's your decision. So people have less concerns about overeating or smoking, even though those things are more likely to kill you than a nuclear power accident. Risk assessment is trying to put some numbers in there, trying to figure out what are the odds of you getting killed by certain activities. This to help us identify problems and try to figure out which ones are the really significant risks and which ones are not too significant, you don't need to worry about them. So there's a number of steps. The first thing is to study the toxicity of chemicals to try to identify which ones are the most hazardous. And then you try to figure out what's the population's exposure to it. How much are they going to be exposed to? How frequent are they going to be exposed to it? What's the length of exposure? And try to figure out then what the actual expected risk of that typical exposure would be. Risk management then is the making of policy decisions and strategies to minimize and manage your risk. There are a number of federal agencies that are tasked with managing risk. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention helps manage a lot of the risk with infectious diseases. The EPA manages risks associated with many hazardous chemicals in the environment. And the Food and Drug Administration manages risk associated with medicines and food additives as well as medical devices and cosmetics. When you're making risk management decisions, oftentimes the policymakers have to balance not just the scientific data, but also economic, social, and political needs. And this is where it often gets difficult, because when you're dealing with a certain chemical, the benefits are often very easy to calculate. They're economic. Using a pesticide reduces our loss of our crop from this pest. That means more food gets produced. The farmers make more money, more economic activity. That's our benefit. The risks are costs, though. And in terms of things like health effects, well, what happens if the farm workers get exposed to too much of this pesticide? Will they lose sperm count? Will that go down? Could they be permanently sterilized? Could they develop some type of cancer? These are questions that are much harder to quantify and harder to prove a cause and effect relationship. So it gets very difficult then to try to balance these things. But here's a flow diagram that shows the risk management in action. The science comes in, science study the hazards to identify which ones are of biggest concern, characterize how toxic they are, figure out the extent of exposure that we can expect people to experience, and then that information goes to the policymakers, and they try to make decisions. Of course, they're not just receiving input from scientists, they also have private citizens, industry and manufacturing, and nonprofit interest groups, all who might have an interest in whether or not this chemical should be regulated. So what happens is the policymakers ignore the scientists and then just do what the lobbyists tell them to do. Okay, sorry. A little sarcasm there, but the idea is that as you balance cost and benefits and try to come up with a policy that is most protective of public health, while at the same time balancing the interests of these groups who might want to continue using the chemicals. There are two ways in which we can approach new products being brought onto the market. The first approach is innocent until proven guilty, where we assume the substance is harmless until it is shown to be harmful. The advantage of innocent until proven guilty is it does promote more economic activity, more technological advancement, and helps the economy and grow and brings more of these products to market so they can be useful and beneficial to us. The downside, though, however, is that it can allow dangerous substances to be used. And there are a number of cases where hazardous materials have been allowed to be sold to the public while it may cause health problems, and we only find out about it after the fact. Some examples include the drug thalidomide, which in the 1950s was given to pregnant women to relieve some of the symptoms of morning sickness. Unfortunately, it turned out that thalidomide caused birth defects, so it was the very drug you probably don't want to give to pregnant women. And they only found that out after many women sued, demonstrating that their children's birth defects were caused by using that drug. In the 1980s, there was a device called the Dalkon Shield. Dalkon Shield was an IUD, What that is, it's a device that is inserted in the uterus as a contraceptive to prevent conception. The idea of an IUD is you put it in when you don't want to get pregnant, and then when you do want to get pregnant, you have your gynecologist remove it, and then normal fertility is supposed to resume. Unfortunately, the Dalcon Shield caused permanent sterility in the women who used it. So once again, a product that probably should have been more thoroughly tested before being released to the public. A more recent example was Vioxx about 10 years ago. This was a pain reliever that was very popular. Became linked to heart ailments and other diseases and had to be taken off the market. The other approach is the precautionary principle. This is where we assume the substance is harmful until it has been shown to be harmless. The advantage of the precautionary principle is that it identifies troublesome materials before they're released to the public. The disadvantage is that it does slow down economic development and the development of new technology and new products. So here's a table from your text demonstrating these two principles in action. Innocent until proven guilty. Two products are developed by manufacturers. Very little testing at first. And then after they've been sold to the public for a while, some products may cause harm to the human health. After much testing and research, they finally figure out which one causes the problem. That unsafe product is recalled and taken off the market. And then the safer one is allowed to continue to be sold. Unfortunately, again, the result of this is that many people were harmed by this material before they identified the problem. Under precautionary principle, two products are developed. There's rigorous testing beforehand. Hopefully that will lead to identifying the problem product before it gets sold to the public, and therefore only the other product gets sold. It has very little impact on human health. There's limited testing required afterwards, and then things go on with very little impact on health over time. Federal agencies that are involved in regulating synthetic chemicals include the FDA. As we said, they monitor food additives, cosmetics, drugs, and medical devices. The EPA regulates pesticides and other synthetic chemicals that are not covered by other laws. And then we have OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which regulates workplace hazards. So they have regulation in place about what type of hazardous chemicals are in the workplace, and they make rules about whether or not, for example, you should wear a respirator when working with a certain chemical, or should you have protective gloves or some other protective gear for them, and what are other safe handling techniques for them. If you're at a work site and you're concerned about a chemical being used under OSHA's laws, you have the right to ask your employer to see a document called the Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS. This is a summary document that describes the nature of the chemical, the health effects associated with it, and what are the recommended protective procedures for using it. Again, that is your right, and these are documents that are widely available online. You can look them up just by Googling them, or you can get them from the chemical manufacturer as well. A federal law that deals with a lot of hazardous chemicals is the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA for short. This was passed in 1976. It gives the EPA authority to monitor chemicals made in or imported in the United States. The EPA can ban substances that it determines pose excessive risk. Many health advocates feel that TSCA is too weak. They believe that the screening is too minimal before the chemical is brought to the market. To push for more testing, you must already establish that toxicity has been proven. So in other words, you have to have evidence that it's toxic before you can demand testing to show that it is toxic. Only about 10% of all chemicals that are being used in industry and in consumer products have been tested for toxicity. Less than 1% have specific regulations for them. And almost none have been tested for their damage to endocrine, nervous, or immune systems. In Europe, they have what's known as the REACH program, which stands for Registration, Evaluation, Authorization, and Restriction of Chemicals. REACH in the European Union shifts the burden of proof for safety to the industry, and it's going to be requiring 30,000 chemicals to be registered with the European Chemical Agency. The Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants targets the 12 most dangerous POPs, which are referred to as the Dirty Dozen. This was enacted in 2004. It's been ratified by over 150 nations. Unfortunately, the United States is not one of them. And it sets guidelines for phasing out these chemicals and encourages transition to safer alternatives. And that brings us to the conclusion of Chapter 10. So we've talked about the hazards in the environment, different types of hazards. We've talked about risk. We've talked about risk management, as well as solutions through regulations and international agreement.